On the last day of August 1983, Korean Air Flight 007 took off from Anchorage with 269 people on board, passengers and crew. Destination, Seoul. They would never make it to Seoul. Part of the reason was because the trajectory got screwed up right at the beginning. If you're on a very long flight and your trajectory at the beginning gets screwed up just a little bit, well, after hours and hours of flying, that little error can turn into a big error. So in the case of Flight 007, Korean Air Flight 007, what was a 2-mile error in terms of trajectory at the beginning ballooned into a 200-mile error by the end. In fact, the airplane, which was supposed to fly the planned route, went over Japan, but the airplane ended up actually flying deep into Soviet airspace, right over Kamchatka, the Kamchatkan Peninsula, which was Russian. Well, Soviet planes were scrambled. I mean, there was no way this was a civilian passenger plane. It had wandered too far. You know, this was not a couple miles off course. This was hundreds of miles. And this wasn't, skirting the edges of Russian airspace. This was right directly through Russian airspace, all the way across Kamchatka. I mean, look up Kamchatka on a map. It's huge. Even knowing about the Mercator projection distorting it, it's a big piece of land, and this plane flew all the way across it and got to the other side. We have the transcripts of the officers debating what they should do and conversing with each other, and the plane is labeled an intruder because of just how far. I mean, there's no way this could be civilian, was the thinking. And so, again, the Soviet planes were scrambled, missiles were fired. It took 12 minutes after impact for the plane to go down, and then Korean Air Flight 007 plummeted into the ocean. No survivors. Actually, that happened just a few miles offshore right here, the Japanese town of Wakkanai. In fact, there were Japanese fishermen from this town who heard the sound, saw the flash, and could smell the fuel in the air. These were tense times. In fact, tension had really ratcheted up. In the 70s, you had this period of détente, but by the time you get to the 80s, it's tense again. And part of that has to do with new leadership in the West. You have real cold warriors coming to power, in particular Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but others too. And, both sides have hundreds of nukes pointed at each other. You have Ronald Reagan announcing earlier in the year his new strategic defense initiative, or what the media called Star Wars, a fancy schmancy futuristic defense program that's going to use lasers and things. That's got the Soviets really scared. There are those, in fact, at the highest echelons of the Soviet leadership, who are convinced that Ronald Reagan is actually planning a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. I mean, so that's how tense things are. The U.S. has recently led some of the, as part of NATO, some of the largest war games ever conducted. And where were they conducted? Right here in the North Pacific, not far from where the incident is going to take place. Meanwhile, you have the Soviets conducting nuclear tests. In fact, they have a nuclear test scheduled for that day, the very day of Flight 007's takedown in Kamchatka. I mean, what are the odds? And at the same time, the U.S. has a spy plane up in the air, a reconnaissance plane up in the air to spy on that test. And that's the day, coincidentally or not, that Korean Air Flight 007 veers 200 miles off course, flies all the way across the width of Kamchatka, the entire peninsula, and is taken down. I think there's something fishy going on here, but it just feels fishy. I have no concrete evidence, but man, what a coincidence that is. And it's almost a moot point anyway for those on board. They're going to end up on September 1st, 1983, because remember the plane has crossed the international date line. They're going to end up on the bottom of the ocean as the latest pawns in an imperial chess match between the two great superpowers. Of course, at first the Soviets denied shooting down the plane. And the U.S. used this as a great, propaganda event, using terms like, barbaric, crimes against humanity, atrocity. You had sitting President Ronald Reagan refer to it as, the Korean airline massacre. This is all ironic, by the way, because only 5 years later, the United States military would down a passenger plane, an Iranian passenger plane, and all 290 people on board would die. So Should we call that the Iranian airline massacre? Anyway, back and forth between the two empires. Eventually the Soviets did have to admit that it had been their fault and that they'd shot down the plane, but they contested the US version. They brought up the fact, hitherto unknown to the rest of the world, that a US spy plane had been in the air at the same time. See, that complicates things. That adds a little bit of culpability to the US side for the whole thing. And so the US sort of starts backing off a little bit at that point. But there was tension. There were Americans boycotting Russian things, Russian planes not being allowed to land, ships not being able to dock. There were people calling for war. I mean, this was the 60s again. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, except it was Korean Air Flight 007. The Cuban Missile Crisis, very famous as a time when the US and the Soviet Union came very close to actual war. Well, a lot of people thought this was the time, in 1983, when it might actually happen. These are the two times where these two empires came the closest to war. With the presence of that American spy plane in the same area at the same time, same day, that transformed the Soviet line. At that point, the Soviet line was that it was the CIA that had done this. And again, very fishy situation, very militarily sensitive area, and in its sensitive moment, actually. And that happens to be the time of this unprecedented, off-course veer right over this area. There's a reason the Soviets could peddle the story. After the Cold War, Russia handed over a lot of the documents related to the incident, but there's still a lot of questions surrounding the incident, and all sorts of theories have cropped up trying to explain just what happened. But one thing's for sure, the two empires came dangerously close to war.